Welcome to the University of Michigan Dentistry Podcast Series, promoting oral health care worldwide.
Now that we have determined the correct occlusal vertical dimension for the patient, we need only one more registration in order to transfer the relationship of the patient's jaws to the articulator. And this relationship is that one which has been referred to probably since the first day you were at the dental school, and that is centric relation. Centric relation registration is as important in complete denture work as it is in any other phase of dentistry. You'll hear a lot more about it in relation to complete dentures in the courses you have in the future and in your clinical work. It is not an easy relationship to record from the patient. It is simple to record on the Visiodont. So this will be an introduction in how to record centric relation for complete denture work. As you remember from one of the definitions of centric relation, it is the horizontal relationship of the jaws with the condyles in the prescribed position at a given vertical. We have already accomplished that given vertical. What we're trying to do actually is simply lute in some way the lower bite rim to the upper bite rim. Key that in some way so that the bite rims can be taken from the mouth, and then it follows logically that put back together outside of the mouth, the master casts placed in the base plates and simply mounted in that position. Now remember, our upper is already mounted. It had nothing to do with vertical or centric. So all we have to do at this point really is mount the lower master cast in the proper relation to the upper master cast on the instrument. And this is done by the centric relation check bite. Now there are many ways of determining centric relation or recording it in the mouth, but what we use is the method called intraoral wax check bite. Now the first thing that we should do is get an idea before we proceed any further when the patient is back in centric, when his condyle is back in the fossa and we're sure he's not protruding. Let's just make a mark on each side of the wax rim in the approximate area of the first bicuspid. That simply helps guide the next step that you'll see in a moment. Now you'll notice that we are going to put the notches for the keying mechanism in the lower, because the notches will not disrupt the configuration of the bite rim itself. And we need this to maintain the configuration of the bite rim for the tooth setting that comes later. We've worked hard in the mouth determining the plane of occlusion, and we don't want to destroy this simply because we're luting these two pieces of wax together. Okay, now the next step, we will take these from the mouth and make some notches for the keying mechanism in the lower, not the upper. Now, that's an important point. People forget. Now these notches, we'll make them distal to the line that we made in the mouth. These notches should be sharp, distinct, and not too large. Now what is not too large? What is small? It's kind of a judgment. I can't tell you exactly how big they should be. Clinically, we observe usually that they are too large. What we're really looking for is a small, distinct notch cut with a sharp blade. Now you can make 2 or 3 of these, and I make them at different angles so that we have some registration in the lateral aspect also. But the important thing is that they have a sharp character to them, so when in the end result we know whether they are perfectly aligned with their opponent or not. So it's important that these wax grooves be very distinct. As a matter of fact, there's a little loose wax I'm going to even touch those up a little bit here to make them more distinct. Okay, let's go to the other side and do the same thing. Now, I'm using the scalpel blade. You can use the buffalo knife if you'd like. The only thing that is important is that we get some nice crisp, sharp grooves. And one more, staying in the back of the line that we made in the mouth, and you'll see in a moment why that was done. Now, it would be incorrect to go into the mouth and simply put some soft wax between the upper and lower bite ribs and have the patient bite together, because we're really allowing no room for the soft wax to flow. And the next step is to allow some space in the upper bite rim for the placement of some soft wax, or actually you could use plaster. Some people use zinc oxide paste and so forth. The idea is when the patient comes together back to his vertical dimension in the mouth, that he does not experience resistance, because the tissues will distort. And the bite registration material, regardless of what it is, must be soft. Now this completes the notching of the lower. You get an idea from this demonstration the size. Now the next step, let's place the upper wax rim back together and align those two lines, two scoring marks that we made while it was in the mouth. And what we should do here on the upper is to make a space in the upper rim by relieving some of that wax, so that when we go back into the mouth and the patient closes and touches the wax in the anterior region, which has not been altered, we know he's back at the proper vertical dimension. And at this time we have manufactured a space in the posterior area which will be filled with the soft material. So at this time, in the upper wax bite rim, we are going to remove a couple of millimeters from the wax occlusal rim. Once again, this just gives us some space for the material. Let's do that on both sides. Now it's important that we don't relieve all of this, because this is what maintains the vertical dimension that we've worked so hard to get. So make sure that you don't remove the entire length of the rim, the wax rim. Now by placing this back together in the approximate position, you can see what the scheme is here. When we go back into the mouth now, and we have the patient bite together, guiding his jaw back into centric relation. As he comes in contact with the wax in the anterior portion, he has returned to his correct vertical dimension. At this time, we have allowed a space with soft material in that space. And when this cools, we, of course, will record the registration, the relationship between the upper and the lower base plates. So at this time, we can return the lower bite rim into the mouth. And what I'm going to do, and I suggest that you do in the laboratory also, is add a small amount of a lubricant, this is simply Vaseline, onto the surfaces where the soft waxes will come together, so that it doesn't stick. Now we're not using in this exercise the actual material that we'll be using in the clinic, because it's too expensive for everybody to go out and buy a whole box of bite registration wax. I am suggesting that you not, however, use the red utility wax. That is has too much of a tendency to be tenacious and unable to pull it apart. Possibly the best thing to use would be a very soft pink baseplate wax. stay away from the red utility wax for the bite registration. For the television demonstration, I'm going to use a wax that you have not seen before. It's called alu wax, and we use it somewhat in the clinic. We use it in the graduate area. There are many types of waxes used for this. Waxes are manufactured just for this type of bite registration. Now this is a wax that's quite soft, as you can see under these lights particularly. And one of the dangers is that when we take the mechanism apart, or the patient opens the mouth, that they distort it on the way out. And this is, it's important that this does not happen. So at this time, I will heat up a small section of the wax and place it onto the prepared areas of the upper wax occlusal rim, not the lower. And we do this in a certain way so that the wax is perfectly soft on both sides of the mouth. If we work to get one side soft and the other is hard by the time we go to the mouth, you can see what will happen. There will be an uneven distribution of force in the mouth, and we'll get a faulty registration. Now, the wax, depending on the kind of wax you use, will depend on how you heat it up. This wax takes very little work to get it to a nice soft consistency. And it should be well sealed. Now we'll add a little bit to the other side. I'm going to go through this whole thing on the demonstration because it's an important procedure, not only in this course, but we can duplicate the clinical situation fairly well. So this is a good chance to really get some good practice in recording centric relation. And one of the things I would like to point out in this exercise, and it's so important upstairs, is a method to get both sides perfectly soft before we go into the mouth. And one way to do that is, well, the worst way to do it, probably the most inefficient, or actually impossible way, is simply to heat it up with a flame, because all we do there is melt the surface, and the surface wax runs off, leaving the mass relatively cold. And it just doesn't work. So what I'm suggesting is we take the blade of a large knife, such as the Buffalo laboratory knife, and we simply, with that blade heated, start cross-hatching this wax down through the depth of the wax. This does more than just heat the surface. And regardless of what type of wax you're using, this will work. It takes a little time and a little patience to get both sides perfectly soft, but it works. Now you see, I'm going from one side to the other. I don't want to do one side completely and then move to the other and go to the mouth. It has to be done at the same time. Now, you see, this is already, just from the last working on it, maybe 30 seconds ago, it is still soft. And I can tell by the resistance of the wax that this side is also. So after doing this 2 or 3 times, it can be determined that the whole mass is soft and offers no resistance. At this time, we can go into the mouth and record centric relation. I'm taking a little extra time here because I want to get a good registration, and also this is exactly what I want you to do in the laboratory. Now, if you have the knife blade too hot, you'll obviously melt the wax. And once in a while, you'll find that you have to build the mass up a little bit if it becomes too soft. Another thing I'd like to point out is I have allowed a space from the end of this wax registration to the area where I began to cut. And that is because when this wax is squeezed and excess moves out when they bite together, patient bites together, we don't want wax to flow up onto this area, see, because this area determines the vertical dimension. And if we end up with a millimeter thickness of wax in this area, we have actually, in essence, opened the patient. His vertical dimension is no longer what we want, but he is open. This wax surface must come flush with the wax surface of the lower occlusal rim. So leave a little space in front of the wax that you're building up on both sides. And then when you look from this direction, you can see that the 2 wax areas that I've been working on extend below the plane of the occlusal plane. And that's, of course, necessary, or we won't get a registration at all. So let me warm up just a little bit more, and then we'll move right to the mouth and record the initial centric relation, check bite. Intraoral wax registration is what we call it. Now that seems very soft on both sides. What I'm trying to discourage here is the use of the hand or torch to soften this mass of wax. It won't work. Now some people at this time would brush flame it with a hand or torch, and that's perfectly all right, but the use of a torch to soften the mass of wax is not the desirable way to do it. Now at this time, everything is soft and we're ready to go back to the mouth. We place the base plate in position, and clinically we guide the patient by holding the base plate onto the ridge, and we guide his jaw back into centric relation and ask him to close together. And as the patient closes, you can see when the rims just touch, that is a reestablishment of his vertical relation. And at that time, we have keyed in the relationship of the upper and lower by these wax layers coming together. Now at this point in the laboratory, it's probably desirable to let the wax cool before we go to the next step. If we take it apart now, everything will distort, and it's mandatory that these wax keys not be distorted in any way, or the registration will be faulty. So let's wait a couple of minutes until this cools, and then we'll come and take the apparatus apart. Now that the wax used for the bite registration has cooled somewhat, and in the mouth it's necessary sometimes to chill this actually with water. And in the laboratory you might want to take your mannequin over to the sink and actually cool it also, because the wax in a warm room remains too soft and can easily distort on the way out. All we've done here now is just allow this to cool, and the next step is to take it apart. Now in the mouth they often come out together, but they will usually come out, if they have been lubricated, can separate by themselves. So now you can see what we have recorded here are some very nice sharp grooves. We do not have any excess wax coming up onto the area which determines our vertical, but we do have some excesses of the wax itself. And in order to check, to make sure that we have the proper registration of centric, it is suggested that either on the mannequin or in the mouth that the excesses in the lateral portions be removed. And that can be done with a large end of the number 7 spatula. We simply remove the excess wax until the grooves that we have recorded become visible. Now this is more meaningful to us. When we go back into the mouth, when the wax is hardened, and check to see that we had the jaw all the way back into centric relation, we can see the grooves coming together. We know that we are correct. If the grooves do not come together, we have two different registrations. So let's do this on both sides of the mannequin. Now this can be done in the patient's mouth, so let's still consider this the mouth. And once again, this is done until the grooves show. Okay, now we take it apart once again. We take the upper from the mouth, and you'll notice that we have removed the excess from the portions on the buccal surfaces, but toward the lingual we still have some pretty large excesses of material. And these actually can form guides. So when the patient closes down, before the bite rims come together, before he has reached his vertical dimension, it is not too difficult for him to actually guide down one of these inclines and will give a faulty registration. So even on the lingual, let's remove the excess bite registration wax. So nothing can influence the centric relation bite except the way the patient bites together normally. The grooves simply check that. They do not guide the patient into any relationship. Now this time we can go back into the patient's mouth once all the excesses have been removed. Once again guide him into centric relation, and we can check by eye to be certain that we have indeed recorded a true centric. And of course, as we said before, we record the centric at a given vertical, so these two wax surfaces must be contacting. Now we have recorded centric relation in the mouth, and we must go to the articulator, because what we're aiming for here, the goal, is to have the master cast, upper and lower master cast, mounted in such a way in the articulator that they are in the same relationship to the opening jaw, the opening axis in the mouth. So at this point, the patient can be dismissed. And the base plates reassembled on the master casts in the mouth. Now, I think an easy way to do it the first time is to simply lute everything together with some sticky wax so nothing can move on us. Now very carefully place the lower, well actually we could put the lower master cast together here at this time. There's no strict regimen for doing this. So what we have to end up with is both base plates carefully centered on the master casts so they don't move. And then the registration, the bite registration that we just obtained, put together in the exact position as it was obtained from the mouth. So at this time, we very carefully place the unit back together. Now you can see, looking at both sides very carefully, and looking at the anterior area where the wax touches, that we have the exact relationship here as we had in the mouth, and that's most important. And now to hold that while we're adding stone and mounting the lower, it might be a good idea at this point. Now that moved on me right there, to recheck everything, because probably most of the mistakes made in mounting centric relation record is in this step. There was some movement made while the lower was being mounted to the upper. Now I realize you can't see this too well probably, but all I'm doing is simply luting together the two wax rims. So now we have this master cast mounted to the upper, base plate mounted to the master cast, the upper rim and the lower rim luted together in the proper centric relation, and the lower rim mounted to the lower master cast firmly. So this whole relationship is correct at this point. And now all we have to do as a final step in mounting the case is to attach the bottom part of the articulator to the lower model. And I'm going to do that the same way that we did with the maxillary, by mixing up some impression plaster and not try to do the whole mounting at one time. Once again we will simply mount in the center, and we can dress up the case at a later moment. I haven't got exactly the right proportions here, but I think we have enough to work with. I'm suggesting, again, using impression plaster, and the model actually should be wetted before you add the plaster, because it will be a weak bond if you add it to a dry cast. So once again, let's just put a pillar of stone or plaster in the middle and make an initial mounting at this time. And this, of course, has to be mounted all the way down. It's most important here that the pin touch the table, and that the pin be flush at the top of the articulator, as it was at the beginning. At this time, we'll remove any excess material, because that will interfere with our next step when we dress up the case. This is just a preliminary mounting. You see it's already starting to set of impression plaster. And because it's setting so fast, I think I can invert it at this time. It's important at this time to, before you mount that, to have this pin flush with the top of the articulator, and also to have the pin in contact with the incisal table. Okay, those two items are most important. Now at this time we've completed the mounting. I'm going to take a few minutes and do the last step that you are to accomplish. That is dress up the mountings, and we'll take it apart and show you what the correct mounting should be for this exercise. After the master casts have been removed from the articulator on their rings, the mountings have been dressed with snow white plaster. And then the final check to make sure that nothing has happened with the relationships. We still have our bite registration, and simply by opening the articulator on the hinge and slowly closing it down, we want to make one last check to make sure that the grooves fit in the way they should, and they do. We know at this point that nothing has happened, and the relationship is the same as we registered from the mouth. Now at this point also, you should check three things. The first is that you do indeed have contact between the wax occlusal rims. The second thing is that the incisal pin be flush with the top of the articulator. At the same time, the pin contacts the incisal table of the articulator. At this point, our registration of face bow, vertical, and centric has been completed, and we are ready for the two-setting exercise. Now let's point out a couple of things here at the last part of this exercise. One is that we still have the overlap between the upper and lower wax occlusal rims. And this, as we pointed out before, has to do with the support of the lip. And normally we do have an overbite and over jet in the denture setup. Now to show you, to go a step ahead and show you what we are aiming for as a goal, I have a set of mounted casts here that go on the articulator in the same setting, and the teeth have been set. And you can see this same relationship. See the horizontal overlap of the incisors, for instance, just as we have on the wax. In other words, we use these wax rims as a guide for setting our teeth. So this completes the exercise, and everybody's mounting should be neat, the articulator should be clean, and it should look as this does before we start the tooth setting exercise.
You've been listening to a presentation from the University of Michigan School of Dentistry, which is dedicated to supporting open learning and open educational resources. This recording is licensed under the Creative Commons. It may be reused and redistributed for nonprofit use. Please attribute materials to the University of Michigan School of Dentistry and redistribute under this same license. For more information on how this and other University of Michigan School of Dentistry recordings may be used, visit www.dent.umich.edu/license.